Hi, this is Brent Grover speaking from Evergreen Consulting for Advanced Supply Chain Solutions powered by IBIS. Today's discussion is part 2 in this month's topic of optimizing product availability. The tagline there is you can't sell from an empty wagon. So first I want to ask you about your approach at your company. Are you focused on the perfect order? In other words, you're putting a lot of time and effort into inventory availability. Are you working on it? You're highly aware of it, but you're really feeling you have a lot more work to do. Or are you concentrating more on inventory turns as opposed to product availability and in turn high levels of customer service? So I want to talk about the best practices that we see in wholesale distribution in terms of managing inventory availability. And the first best practice is spending time and investing money on inventory management. So in terms of service levels, as mentioned last week, high service levels are expected by customers today. There's not a lot of differential between typical service levels and the service levels from the best companies. So it's very tough to be distinctive in the area of service levels, but of course if your service levels are not good, then it really stands out because the customer's expectations are so high. The cornerstone of excellent customer service is inventory availability, which we traditionally base on usage projections from the field using historical data, typically 3 months of historical data. We also use our information about vendor lead times, which tends to be not always totally dependable, and for that reason we have safety stock to cover inadequacies in our projected usage and our vendor lead times. Now, high levels of safety stock, of course, improve customer service, but they also cause for us issues in terms of high inventory levels and potentially ultimately dead stock. But if our service isn't good, we risk losing customers and losing orders. And for many of us, the real challenge is, well, we're measuring fill rate. What fill rate is good enough? Is it 95? Is it 96? Is it 98%? Rule of thumb is to increase our service level from 95 to 96% requires a doubling of our inventory. Improving it from 96 to 98% requires doubling inventory again. And of course, there are limitations as to how much inventory we can carry. So the counter to that argument about high levels of customer service is the downside of having too much inventory. It's a very important leverage, a profitability lever. Typically, we turn our overall assets over in wholesale distribution 3.5 to 4 times a year. Well, in order to do that, we have to have very good inventory turnover because 80% of our assets are receivables and inventory. And about half of that for most distributors, half of that asset base, about 40% of the, half of the 80%, about 40% of the assets are inventory. So if we don't turn the inventory, we're not going to get good asset turnover. Therefore, it affects our return on assets and return on investment. And the two measures that are most popular are turn and earn, which is multiplying, for example, 8 inventory turns per year times 25% margin in my example, and this is just talking about warehouse business, not direct shipment business. 8 times 25 is an index of 100. And how does that relate to a more old-fashioned measurement, but still popular, GMROI, G-M-R-O-I, gross margin return on inventory? And you could use the same numbers here. 8 inventory turns times 25% equals a 200% gross margin return on inventory. So these two measurements are very much related. But for return on investment, inventory turns really matter. And even when interest rates are very low, and you might be thinking that inventory rates today are so low that there's no downside in having a lot of extra inventory. And I just want to remind you that inventory carrying costs, which run in total about 20% a year, and that includes occupancy costs, handling costs, receiving, putting stock away, moving it around, damage, obsolescence, pilferage, property taxes, insurance. Those costs run around 20% a year. So even if interest rates were zero, inventory costs are still running you about 20% a year. So the key to the perfect order is product availability. Inventory is about 40% of our assets. Asset turnover is critical to achieving a high level of return on investment. And knowing that inventory availability is the essence of the perfect order. I'm going to talk next week about another one of the best practices that the best distributors use. This week we were talking about the investment in time and the investment of capital in inventory management personnel and systems. Next week and the week after, we're going to talk about two other best practices. So until then, this is Brent Grover from Evergreen Consulting for Advanced Supply Chain Solutions powered by IBIS.